As the economist who actually served on the Bank of England says on the front page of the Financial Times today, his plan to halve the deficit just by passing a law is a complete con. Now, I have to say, to address this issue directly would have been in the best traditions of his party. In the past, Labour Prime Ministers like Callaghan, Labour Chancellors like Jenkins, did in the end try to do the right thing, not the popular thing. They actually started to try and mend the country's finances after the irresponsible spending spree of a Labour government. Why won't this Prime Minister do the right thing? Why won't he think of the national interest? Give way, the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Will he be keeping, if he gets the opportunity, the promise to increase the number of battalions? And if so, how will he fund it?
We're in no doubt that there is enormous amounts of waste across the Ministry of Defence. And the Ministry of Defence, in terms of its manpower, is now bigger than many parts of the armed services itself. But I have to say to the Honourable Lady, we have made the tough choices on public sector pay, on pensions, on benefits. What you've got in Britain today is you've got an opposition behaving like a government and a government behaving like an irresponsible opposition. And one cabinet minister this week said it himself. One cabinet minister boasted that this was intended to be the most political Queen's speech in the last 12 years. This lot are actually proud of the fact that instead of trying to govern in the national interest or pass laws to improve the lot of the country, all they're trying to do is embarrass the Conservative Party. What a pathetic way to run a government. The great irony is they're not even very good at these dividing lines. Remember what happened to the last one? Remember that one we had in the summer? Week after week they boasted about Labour investment versus Tory 10% cuts. Then we saw their own leaked Treasury documents, and what did they have plans for? 10% cuts. Only this Prime Minister could draw a dividing line and find himself on the wrong side of it. This Queen's speech is a time to judge this government, not only on the last 12 years, but on the last 2.5 years when this Prime Minister's been in charge. And there can only be one conclusion. This government has been a monumental failure. Every promise he's made has turned to dust. He promised full employment. In fact, unemployment is 500,000 higher than when he became Chancellor. He promised to make Britain the great global success story of this century. Our economy has just been overtaken by Italy. He promised 3 million new homes. That was his big boast when he became leader. 3 million new homes. House building in England today is at its lowest level since 1947. Think back to those big promises he made on the steps of Downing Street, that his government would be a government of all the talents. He would always be prudent on the economy, and his moral compass would guide him in everything he did. Each one of those claims has been completely discredited. Let's take the government of all the talents, referred to by the Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras. Where are they all now? No longer tethered to the government, they've wandered off. Lord Carter, the digital guru, where's he now? He's a management consultant. Lord Malloch Brown, he was the great UN expert, now an advisor to global redesign. And then there's Lord Digby Jones, now back in business, but at least he's still making speeches. And I have, Mr. Speaker, for the sake of greater accuracy, obtained a copy of his latest effort. This is what the minister, that the Prime Minister appointed, has to say. Today, we have a tired, stale government. It's a big 6 months ahead. A general election cannot come too quickly. Then looking back on his period in government, he had this to say. The trouble with socialism, he said, now having seen it work from the inside, is pretty soon you run out of spending other people's money. I couldn't have put it better than myself. Darzai, Carter, Vadera, Malloch Brown, Digby Jones, all gone. The only jobs this Prime Minister has created are for his cronies, all of whom have repaid his generosity by leaving his government at the first opportunity, but of course keeping their well-upholstered seats in the House of Lords. Never has so much ermine been wasted. Never has so many stoats died in vain. Never mind jobs for the boys. Under this Prime Minister, it's stoats for the goats. The Prime Minister's, his main promise on the steps of Downing Street, indeed his whole qualification for the job, was his economic stewardship. But everything he's told us has turned out to be wrong. He promised an end to boom and bust. In fact, he's delivered the longest and deepest bust since records began. He said we were best prepared. Let's see if this one's ready for some ermine.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving me? This government is committed to halving this deficit over the next 4 years. If If he has a plan to cut this deficit faster, could he tell us when and by how much?
Let's be quite clear about halving the deficit. Next year it's forecast to be 14%. When Dennis Healey was Chancellor and Britain nearly went bust, it was 7%. So under this Prime Minister's magnificent plan to halve the deficit, we'll be back to where we were, virtually bankrupt, under Labour last time they wrecked our economy. And in terms of who's got a plan to cut it, who has made, I'm sorry to repeat myself, who's made the tough choices on pensions, on public sector pay, on benefits? It's the opposition behaving like a government, not the government behaving like an opposition. He said that we would lead the world out of recovery. Do we all remember that one? In fact, the rest of the world, America, France, Germany, the Eurozone, they're all out of recession and we're still in it. And his whole specialism, the whole specialism was meant to be financial services, regulation, the future of banking. Yet in this country, we've had the biggest bank bailout in the world, the biggest bank run in Europe, and proportionate to the size of our economy, more support pumped in from taxpayers into the banking system than any other major economy. And after all this, the Governor of the Bank of England's verdict is that there's been little real reform. What was supposed to be this Prime Minister's greatest strength has turned out to be his greatest weakness. And I have to say, the Financial Services Bill in the Queen's speech today will not help, as it keeps the failed tripartite system in place. That system needs to go, and with a Conservative government it will. And what about the moral compass? What about the great moral compass we were promised? In the last 3 years, we've had slogans borrowed, taken directly from the BNP about British jobs for British workers. We had the Prime Minister's own personally appointed Downing Street spokesman smearing members of the opposition. And with the abolition of the 10p tax ban, a Labour government hitting the lowest earners in our country. And I have to say to honourable members opposite, if you thought the abolition of the 10p tax was bad, just wait for the small print of the government's new care service. Those benefits that millions of elderly people rely on, attendance allowance, disability living allowance, their government is planning to scrap them. And I have to say, that the last 2 years have not just been a moral failure for the Prime Minister, they have been a monumental failure for our country. And if we're going to make sure this failure is never repeated, we need to understand the reasons behind it. There's the Labour belief that the answer to every problem is just more big government and more spending. Now, we've seen the welfare budget rise, but the poorest in our country have got poorer and there are more of them. We've seen the budget for affordable housing quadruple, but the number of new social homes built in Britain has been cut in half. The next failure is that Whitehall always knows best under this government. So we've had nearly 50 criminal justice acts and over 3,000 new offences, but violent crime is up by nearly 70%. We've seen nearly £1 billion spent on truancy initiatives, but the number of children skipping school is up by 45%. And the greatest failure of all, I believe, can be traced directly back to this Prime Minister. Political calculation dressed up as a moral conviction. When you look behind the curtain of the great clunking machine of this government, all you see is someone frantically pulling levers, pushing buttons, not trying to improve the country, but desperately trying to relaunch his failing political career and somehow get one over on his opponents. Instead of some half-baked Queen's speech and a delayed general election, we need an immediate election and a real Queen's speech. A real Queen's speech would acknowledge just how broke this country is and have a proper plan to reduce the deficit. As I've said, we're not just talking about the deficit, we're setting out what should be done about it. Yes, we'll take out the waste, the bureaucracy, the ID cards, all the Labour nonsense, but we've made the tough choices too. A real Queen's speech would acknowledge the tragedy of unemployment, with 1 in 5 young people not getting a job, and introduce a proper welfare reform involving the private and voluntary sectors and paying them by results. A real Queen's speech wouldn't tinker with the education system, but would break open the state monopoly, allowing new schools to be set up and giving parents more choice. A real Queen's speech would mean real reform of our NHS, real choice for patients, real transparency, with health outcomes published online so that doctors are accountable to their patients. Instead, we got a Queen's speech that is just a Labour press release on Palace parchment. He's not legislating on the measures the country needs. He's desperately trying a few tricks to save his own skin. And when the country is crying out for real change, are we really going to be subjected to 6 more months of endless relaunches, bogus legislations, and these fake dividing lines that he keeps going on about? The simple fact that even this country cannot ignore is that sometime in the next 6 months, he's going to have to stop dithering, leave the bunker, go to the palace and finally